Some battles don't end on the battlefield. They just find quieter places to begin again. A cicada buzzed in the heavy silence of a suburban afternoon, the kind of silence so pristine it bordered on sacred. The houses in the preserve at Meadow Creek stood like uniformed soldiers in a perfectly arranged formation. Identical roofs, identical hedges, identical lives. And in the middle of it all, Staff Sergeant Michael Corrigan sat alone on the edge of his porch, hands still, eyes fixed on nothing. His new home was a study in peace, but it was a fragile, curated kind, the kind that demanded compliance rather than offered refuge. 3 tours in Iraq had trained him to listen for danger in chaos. But now, surrounded by birdsongs and trimmed lawns, it was the quiet that made his skin prickle. He had come here to rest, to bury the ghosts, to find a version of America he still believed in. But peace, as he would soon learn, can be just another battlefield, with its own uniforms, its own orders, and its own quiet war. He had bought the house site unseen, relying on photos and the promises of a smooth-talking realtor. He'd used the bulk of his savings and the benefits he'd earned through years of service. He wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for quiet. He was looking for a place where he could finally unpack the last ghosts of his past and let them fade into the soft afternoon light. On his 3rd day in the new house, he opened a long, worn footlocker, stenciled with his name. It smelled of canvas and time. He bypassed the neatly folded uniforms, the shoebox of medals, the photographs of smiling faces he would never see again. His hands went to the very bottom, to an object wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it. It was an American flag, not a new one, crisp from a plastic package, but one that had seen service. It had flown over his command post outside Fallujah. It was a little faded by the relentless sun, a little frayed at the edges from the desert wind. But it was whole. It was a promise kept. With the quiet reverence of a man entering a church, he mounted a simple black iron bracket to the white post of his front porch. He unfolded the flag, the familiar snap of the fabric, a sound that echoed deep in his memory. He attached the grommets and let it hang. It wasn't a giant flag, not a statement of aggressive defiance. It was a simple, standard-sized flag, a quiet declaration of identity, of remembrance. It was for his country, yes, but it was also for them, for Miller, for Sanchez, for the kid from Ohio whose name he could no longer speak aloud. His next-door neighbor, a kind-faced widower in his late 60s named David, was watering his petunias. He saw the flag, smiled a genuine, warm smile, and gave Mike a firm thumbs up. Mike, not a man of easy grins, gave a short, appreciative nod in return. For the first time in a decade, a knot in his chest he didn't even know was there began to loosen. This was community. This was peace. This was home. He had followed the rules, bought the house, and now he was a part of something. He was wrong. The harbinger of his mistake arrived 4 days later in a pristine silver Lexus that purred to a stop at his curb. A woman in her early 60s emerged. She was dressed in crisp linen pants and a silk blouse, her hair a helmet of perfectly coiffed silver. She moved with the unshakable certainty of a person who has never been told no. In one hand, she carried a wicker welcome basket filled with artisanal jams and flavorless crackers. In the other, she gripped a clipboard like a weapon. "Staff Sergeant Corrigan?" she chirped, her voice a blend of honey and steel. "I'm Carol Van Dyke. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, and I personally chair the welcoming committee. On behalf of the entire preserve at Meadow Creek, we are just so very proud to have a hero move into our community." Mike, standing on his porch, felt a familiar prickle of caution. He had heard speeches like this before, usually right before a high-risk mission briefing. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice even. "Just Mike is fine." "Of course, Mike," she said, her eyes scanning his porch, his lawn, the precise alignment of his hedges. Her gaze was an appraisal, and he felt like he was failing an inspection. Then, her eyes landed on the flag. They narrowed almost imperceptibly. The smile didn't falter, but its warmth evaporated. "It's a lovely flag," she began, the patronizing tone setting Mike's teeth on edge. "And we are all such patriots here, truly. But there is just one small matter of housekeeping I need to address." She tapped her clipboard. "Our covenants, which I'm sure you read thoroughly before closing, are very specific about maintaining the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood. It's what keeps our property values the highest in the county, you see." She paused, expecting him to understand. Mike said nothing. "Article 4, Section B, Paragraph 3, she recited from memory. It prohibits any non-approved external fixtures, attachments, or displays. That includes signage, non-standard mailboxes, and, unfortunately, flags mounted in that fashion. So, I'll need you to take that down." Mike stared at her. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The hum of the refrigerator was gone, replaced by a dull ringing in his ears. He had faced down armed insurgents, navigated treacherous city streets under fire, and comforted dying friends. He had never felt the kind of cold, quiet rage that was now building in his chest. He kept his voice level, a trick he'd mastered long ago. "Ma'am, with all due respect, it's the American flag. And we all love it," Carol countered brightly, as if he were a slow child. "That's why we have the beautiful community-approved flagpole at the entrance to the subdivision. It's illuminated at night and everything. But individual displays, it just opens the door to, well, to anything. Before you know it, someone's flying a pirate flag for their son's birthday party, and the whole character of the neighborhood is compromised. The rules are the rules for a reason, Mike. It's what keeps the preserve beautiful. I'm sure a man of your background understands the importance of order." She placed the welcome basket on his porch step, a clear dismissal. Beside it, she laid a crisp, white envelope. "This is just the preliminary notice, a formality. You have 7 days to comply. Welcome to the neighborhood." She turned and walked back to her Lexus, her mission accomplished. Mike stood motionless, watching her drive away. He looked at the flag, its colors suddenly more vibrant against the bland, beige conformity of the houses. He looked at the insulting basket of jams and the sterile white envelope that felt more like a threat than a welcome. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet life he had so desperately sought was over. He had just been involuntarily recalled to active duty. This time, the war was on the home front. Mike Corrigan just drew a line in the manicured grass of Meadow Creek. If you believe in standing for what is right, give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments, what does the American flag mean to you? Stay with us, because this is just the beginning of a story you won't want to miss. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories from NX. The official violation notice was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the HOA's logo embossed in gold at the top. It cited the covenant, the date of the observation, and the required remedy. The language was polite, sterile, and utterly inflexible. It felt less like a notice and more like an ultimatum. For 2 days, Mike did nothing. He watched the flag on his porch, a silent sentinel in a war he hadn't asked for. Every time he saw it, he felt a mix of pride and a slow-burning anger. He was a man who followed the chain of command, who respected rules, but this rule felt like a perversion of everything he'd ever stood for. It was order without honor. He decided to approach the problem as he would any tactical challenge, through established channels, with clear and respectful communication. He would attend the monthly HOA board meeting. He would make his case as a reasonable man to other reasonable people. He spent an evening preparing his thoughts, not for a fight, but for a discussion. He assumed a fundamental level of goodwill. It was a costly assumption. The community clubhouse was as sterile as the violation notice. The air was thick with the scent of air freshener and self-satisfaction. The board sat at a long table at the front, with Carol Van Dyke squarely in the center, the commanding officer of this small, domestic army. The other 4 members flanked her, 2 men and 2 women, all with the same placid, entitled expressions. They looked less like a board of governors and more like a jury that had reached its verdict before the trial began. The meeting droned on with tedious reports. The treasurer spoke of sprinkler head replacements. The head of the Architectural Review Committee reported on the unauthorized color of the miller's new mailbox. Mike listened, his patience wearing thin. This wasn't a community. It was a kingdom of petty tyrants, and Carol was its queen. When the floor was opened for new business, Mike stood. He was calm, his voice steady. "My name is Mike Corrigan. I live at 212 Patriot Court." Carol smiled her tight, professional smile. "Yes, Mike, we're all so glad to have you. What can we do for you?" Mike made his case. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wrap himself in the flag, metaphorically speaking. He simply and eloquently explained what that specific flag meant to him. He spoke of it as a reminder of the price of the quiet streets they all enjoyed. He asked for a simple exception, a small variance to the rule in honor of that service. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he concluded. "I'm just asking for a little understanding." He sat down. The room was quiet. He glanced at David, his neighbor, who was seated a few rows back. David gave him a slight, nervous nod of support. Mike felt a flicker of hope. He had been reasonable. He had been respectful. Then Carol stood up, and with the skill of a seasoned politician, she dismantled him. "Thank you, Mike, for that very emotional testimony," she began, the word emotional dripping with condescension. It was a verbal pat on the head. "And again, let me say that we are all so grateful for your service. My own father served in Korea, so I understand sacrifice." She paused, letting that false equivalence hang in the air. "But," she continued, her voice shifting to one of grave responsibility, "this board has a sacred duty. Our duty is to every single homeowner in this preserve. It is a duty to protect their investment, which, for most of us, is the largest investment of our lives. The covenants were not written to be picked apart by individual sentiment. They are the very bedrock of our community. They are the guarantee that the home you buy today will be worth more tomorrow. They are the shield against chaos." She turned her gaze on Mike, no longer smiling. When one person decides the rules don't apply to them, where does it end? If we allow a flag, must we then allow a political sign, a religious statue, a brightly painted bird bath? We cannot make exceptions. To make one exception is to invalidate the rule for everyone. That is the law. And we are a community of laws. She looked at her fellow board members. "The board has already reviewed this issue based on Mr. Corrigan's preliminary notice. Do I have a motion to uphold the covenant as written?" A man on the board mumbled, "So moved." Another seconded. "All in favor?" 4 hands went up instantly. The fifth, a woman who had seemed to be listening intently to Mike, hesitated for a second before her hand floated up as well. "The motion carries," Carol announced, a note of finality in her voice. She looked directly at Mike. "You have 5 days to comply before the fines begin to accrue. Next item on the agenda, the annual pet parade." Mike sat there, stunned. It wasn't just the denial. It was the public humiliation. It was the way she had twisted his sincere request into an act of selfish individualism. It was the way she had weaponized patriotism to serve pettiness. He looked around the room. A few people looked at him with sympathy, but most were now engrossed in a debate about leash lengths for the pet parade. David wouldn't meet his eye. He stood up and walked out of the clubhouse, the sound of their trivialities fading behind him. He stepped into the cool night air. The battle lines were no longer just lines on a map in a distant desert. They were drawn right down the middle of his manicured front lawn. He walked home, his stride falling into the familiar steady cadence of a soldier on the march. He reached his porch and looked up at the flag, bathed in the soft yellow light. They had given him his orders, and for the first time in his adult life, he was going to disobey a direct command. That flag was not coming down. The war had just begun. The first fine arrived 2 days later, $100. The letter stated that the fine would double every 7 days. The violation remained uncorrected. Mike read it, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, and filed it away in a folder labeled HOA. Within a week, a second letter arrived. Outstanding balance $300. He was no longer just a resident. He was a debtor. He was being systematically defined as a problem. Mike knew that a lone soldier on an exposed flank was a vulnerable target. He needed allies. He still clung to the belief that his neighbors, the actual people of the preserve, were fundamentally decent. He thought, if he could just explain the situation to them, away from Carol Van Dyke's intimidating presence, they would understand. He drafted a simple, one-sentence petition. "We, the undersigned homeowners of the preserve at Meadow Creek, support an amendment to the HOA covenants to permit the respectful display of the American flag." He made 20 copies. That Saturday, he began his own campaign, walking door to door. The reception was a lesson in the quiet corrosion of fear. At the first house, a young couple with a toddler, the husband looked nervously over Mike's shoulder toward Carol's house down the street. "Look, man, I'm with you. I really am," he whispered. "But we just moved in. Carol's in charge of the pool passes. We just don't want to make waves." He didn't sign. At the next house, a woman listened patiently and then said, "Frankly, my husband and I agree with the board. We paid a premium for a neighborhood with a certain look. I don't mean to be rude, but your flag does clash." She closed the door. House after house, the story was the same. Sympathy mixed with apathy. Agreement mixed with fear. He was no longer Mike Corrigan, their new neighbor. He was a conflict they didn't want. He was a problem that might splash onto them. Only David, the widower, signed, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote his name. "My father fought on Iwo Jima," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "He'd be ashamed of me if I didn't." For Mike, this was more disheartening than any battlefield setback. In combat, you at least knew who the enemy was. Here, the lines were blurry, shifting with the social winds. His isolation was nearly complete, and Carol, a master strategist in her own right, pressed her advantage. The next edition of the HOA newsletter, the Preserve Press, landed on every doorstep. On the front page was a glowing feature on the upcoming 4th of July picnic, complete with a photo of Carol smiling next to the community flagpole. On page 2, There was a pointed article she had written titled, "What Makes a Good Neighbor?" It didn't mention Mike by name, but it didn't have to. It spoke of the shared sacrifice of following rules for the greater good and lamented those who put personal displays above community harmony. It was a public branding. Mike was now officially, in print, a bad neighbor. This is a tactic as old as time, a story that repeats itself in countless forms. Think of the stories of innovators, of people who dared to be different, only to be branded as heretics or troublemakers by the establishment. Galileo was a bad neighbor to the church for suggesting the earth revolved around the sun. His personal display of scientific fact threatened the aesthetic uniformity of their cosmos. In small towns across America for generations, the family that painted their house a different color, or the teenager who listened to a new kind of music, was often subjected to the same campaign of quiet isolation, branded as "not one of us." The tools were different. Gossip over a fence instead of a newsletter. But the goal was the same: enforce conformity through social pressure. Mike was now part of that long, proud, and often painful history of individuals who refused to bend. The campaign against him reached a new level a few nights later. Under the cover of darkness, someone came onto his property. They didn't break windows or slash tires. The vandalism was more insidious, more personal. Mike had taken up gardening as a form of therapy, a way to create life after witnessing so much death. His prized possessions were 24 immaculate rose bushes that lined his walkway. That morning, he found them trampled, their stems broken, petals scattered across the lawn. Staring at the ruined roses, something inside Mike shifted permanently. This wasn't about a flag anymore. It wasn't about a bylaw or aesthetic uniformity. That was all a smokescreen. This was about power. It was about a petty tyrant who had wrapped herself in the flag to justify her dominion over a small patch of grass, and who would crush anyone who dared to question it. His objective changed. He was no longer defending a position. He was now gathering intelligence for a counteroffensive. The quiet gardener was gone. The staff sergeant was back on duty. Have you ever seen a small injustice ignored until it grew into something ugly? The story of Mike Corrigan is a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right often means standing alone, at least at first. We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if this story resonates with you, please consider hitting that subscribe button. You are the reason we can continue to tell them. Defeat has a particular taste, metallic and bitter, like old coffee in a cold tin cup. For Mike Corrigan, that taste was familiar. He had felt it in the pit of his stomach when missions went wrong, when the calculus of war resulted in losses that could never be reclaimed. He felt it now, sitting in his silent, orderly living room, holding a letter from the HOA's law firm. The language was no longer polite. It was the cold, hard prose of legal warfare. It spoke of liens, of foreclosure, of the potential loss of the one place on earth he had sought as his sanctuary. His flag was no longer on the porch. The day the legal threat arrived, he had taken it down. The act felt like a surrender, a physical sickness in his soul. He had folded it with the same precision he always used, but his hands felt clumsy, his movements a betrayal. The empty bracket on his porch post looked like a wound. His lowest point came when David, his only ally, knocked on his door, his face a mask of misery. "Mike, I'm sorry," he stammered, holding out the petition sheet. "Carol, she came by. She was talking about my garden gnome, said it wasn't an approved color. $100 fine. She said more would be coming. I can't afford a fight." He couldn't look Mike in the eye. Can I take my name off?" "It's all right, David," Mike said, his voice betraying none of the crushing weight he felt. "I understand." He took the paper. His army of 2 was now an army of 1. He was completely, utterly alone, an island of dissent in a sea of fearful conformity. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He sat in the dark, the lawyer's letter on the table next to the folder of HOA violations. He was a trained strategist, a man who could analyze terrain and anticipate enemy movements. But this battlefield was alien to him. The weapons weren't bullets and IEDs. They were bylaws and social pressure. The enemy wasn't a visible insurgent. It was a smiling woman in a Lexus who wielded the concept of community like a cudgel. He thought he was beaten. He thought about selling the house, cutting his losses and moving on. But where would he go? The preserve at Meadow Creek wasn't just a place. It was an idea. It was the America he thought he had been fighting for. A place of peace, order, and security. And if that idea was corrupt here, it could be corrupt anywhere. Running wasn't a solution. It was just a delay. In the military, when you're facing an overwhelming and unconventional enemy, you don't charge blindly. You fall back on intelligence. You find the weakness in their supply lines, the flaw in their logistics, the crack in their command structure. Defeated, alone, and with nothing left to lose, Mike Corrigan did what he was trained to do. He began his war. His kitchen table became his command center. He spread out the documents David had given him, the HOA's annual budget reports for the last 3 years. They were dense, boring, filled with line items for common area maintenance, pool chemicals, landscaping, and administrative fees. It was designed to be impenetrable, to bore residents into submission. But Mike had spent countless hours in sweltering tents, poring over logistics reports that were just as dull, searching for the one discrepancy that meant supplies were being siphoned off. He had a gift for finding the signal in the noise. He brewed a pot of coffee and began. With a ruler and a red pen, he went through the numbers, line by line. For hours, it was just a sea of figures. But then, a pattern began to emerge. Under the category Community Beautification, the numbers were wrong. They were too high, too round, and they were inconsistent. One quarter, it was $5,000. The next, $15,000. For what? The occasional planting of pansies around the community sign? This was the thread. He needed to pull it. He saw the vendor listed for every one of these payments. Patriot Enterprises, LLC. The name was almost a caricature, a parody of the very ideal Carol pretended to champion. It was too perfect. Mike put down his pen. He needed more information. This was a moment that called for a specialist. He thought back through his old unit, through the faces of the men he trusted with his life. He remembered Sergeant Rick Numbers Costello, a quiet genius with a calculator who had left the service and become a forensic accountant. A man who could make a spreadsheet sing. Mike picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. Costello. A gruff voice answered. "Numbers, it's Corrigan," Mike said. There was a pause, then a warm laugh on the other end. "Mikey, I'll be damned. Last I heard you were buying a farm and raising chickens. Don't tell me you need bail money." "Not yet," Mike said, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "I need you to look at something for me. I've got a little insurgency problem here in suburbia. I think their logistics are dirty." He emailed the scans of the budget reports to Costello. 2 hours later, at 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was a text from Numbers. Got it. Patriot Enterprises, LLC, incorporated 2 years ago. Registered agent is a man named Frank Miller. Address is a P.O. box. Classic shell. Give me 24 hours. I'll get you their bank records. This is gonna be fun. Mike looked at the text, then at the neat, orderly houses sleeping outside his window. The tide of the war was turning. The enemy had overplayed her hand and exposed her supply lines. The strategist had found his opening, and he was about to press the attack. Victory in warfare is often a matter of timing and nerve. The day before the annual Homeowners Association General Meeting, Carol Van Dyke made a tactical error, born of arrogance. She called Mike Corrigan. "Michael," she said, her voice dripping with artificial magnanimity. "I've been thinking about your situation. And because this community values the contributions of our veterans, the board has authorized me to make you a special offer. We will forgive all your outstanding fines. We will grant you a one-time, non-transferable variance to display your flag." Mike waited. He knew the other shoe was about to drop. "In return," she continued, "all we ask is that at the meeting tomorrow night, you stand up and make a brief statement. Thank the board for its flexibility, apologize for any divisiveness your actions may have caused, and pledge to be a team player going forward. It's a win-win, don't you think?" This was the moment of crisis, the ultimate dilemma. Here was his out. Here was his conscious desire, the flag on his porch, handed to him on a silver platter. All he had to do was bend the knee. All he had to do was betray the very principle he was fighting for. All he had to do was stand before his neighbors and validate the corrupt system that had humiliated him, isolated him, and threatened his home. The old Mike, the man who just wanted peace, might have been tempted. But the staff sergeant, the leader of men, knew that some victories are just another name for surrender. "Thank you for the offer, Carol," Mike said, his voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. "But I think I'll take my chances at the meeting." He hung up the phone. He had just refused the enemy's terms of surrender. Now, there was no turning back. The night of the general meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It had the electric tension of a courtroom before a verdict is read. Word had spread. Everyone knew this was the night of the showdown between the HOA president and the stubborn veteran. Mike walked in and took a seat at the back. He carried a single manila folder and a USB flash drive. He was not dressed for battle. He was dressed in a simple sport coat and slacks. He looked like just another homeowner. Carol, at the podium, was in her element. She opened the meeting with a soaring 5-minute speech that was a masterclass in performative patriotism. She spoke of shared values, of community, of protecting our way of life. She spoke of the flag at the entrance as a beacon of our unity. Her speech was met with enthusiastic applause. She was setting the stage, painting Mike as the enemy of that unity. Finally, she came to his agenda item. "And now," she said with a sigh of theatrical sadness, "we must address the unfortunate matter of the violation at 212 Patriot Court. The board has voted to enforce the covenants. We will now open the floor to a final vote from the homeowners to authorize legal action." She looked at Mike. "Mr. Corrigan, do you have anything to say before we vote?" This was it, the moment of truth. Everyone leaned forward. They expected him to yell. They expected him to argue about his rights, about his service. They expected a desperate, angry rant. Mike walked calmly to the podium. He placed his folder on the lectern and inserted the flash drive into the laptop, connected to the projector. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, some hostile, some sympathetic, most just nervously curious. "Thank you, Carol. My name is Mike Corrigan," he began, his voice filling the room, not with anger, but with quiet authority. "I want to thank you for that speech. You're right. our shared values are the most important thing. Values like integrity, transparency, and fiduciary duty. A confused murmur went through the crowd. This was not the speech they were expecting. On the screen behind him, the first slide appeared. It was a page from the HOA's annual budget. "I'm not going to talk about my flag tonight," Mike continued. "I want to talk about our money, your money." He clicked to the next slide. It was a close-up of the community beautification line item. As you can see, over the last 2 years, we've spent over $90,000 on beautification projects. I was curious what that entailed, so I looked into the vendor we paid, a company called Patriot Enterprises. The next slide showed the corporate registration for Patriot Enterprises, LLC. The registered agent was Frank Miller. Carol watched, a look of confusion hardening into alarm. "Now, that name might not mean much to most of you," Mike said, "but it might mean something to our president. Frank Miller is her brother-in-law." The room gasped. Carol went pale. "I was curious," Mike went on, his tone still perfectly even. "If paying $90,000 to a direct family member for planting a few pansies constituted a conflict of interest. But then, I discovered something more interesting." He clicked again. A bank statement appeared on the screen, obtained legally by his forensic accountant. It showed a payment of $15,000 from the HOA to Patriot Enterprises. The next slide showed another statement from the same day. A withdrawal of $12,000 from Patriot Enterprises account, and a corresponding deposit of $12,000 into the personal account of Carol Van Dyke. "It seems Patriot Enterprises isn't just in the landscaping business," Mike said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying the weight of the final kill shot. "It's in the money laundering business." The room erupted. It was chaos. People were shouting, pointing at Carol, who stood frozen at her table, her mask of composure shattered, revealing the panicked, guilty woman beneath. Mike had not raised his voice. He had not made a single accusation. He had simply presented his intelligence briefing. He had laid out the facts and allowed his neighbors to draw their own inescapable conclusion. The resolution was swift. An emergency vote removed Carol and her entire board. The police were called. In the stunned aftermath, as people were trying to process the betrayal, it was David who stood up. "I think," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "we need a new president. Someone with integrity. Someone who isn't afraid to fight for what's right. I nominate Mike Corrigan." The nomination was seconded, and Mike was elected by a roaring, unanimous vote. The grill hissed. Children laughed. Fireflies blinked lazily in the early July dusk. From his porch, Mike watched as neighbors clinked glasses past plates and shared stories they might never have told without the quiet war that had forced them to choose sides. The flag swayed gently above them, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in peace. He had fought to plant it once in the sand of a foreign desert. Now, it flew freely in the soil he called home. Mike took a long sip from his bottle, the sounds of life humming around him. This time, the silence didn't prickle. It soothed. He hadn't come to lead. He hadn't come to fight. But sometimes, the final battle is the one that reminds you what peace truly means. And this was peace. If Mike Corrigan's story moved you, tell us. What does standing for something mean to you? Your voice matters. Share it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to NX Incredible Stories. Because courage, quietly lived, is worth telling out loud.